Welcome to episode 7 of NIL Active. Today we have Dan Lust and John Azzato of the New York Law School NIL Pro Bono Project. Welcome, guys.
How you doing? Thanks for
having us.
Really appreciate having you guys on. So what is your guys' background? How'd you get into the law and NIL or sports in particular?
I don't mind taking this first, John.
Yeah, take that first. We'll follow up after you.
So I guess I wear a number of hats, but at least at the present time, I am New York Law School's sports law professor. I also teach sports law at Fordham. John, I had the great pleasure of having John in my class last year. So yeah, I guess we can. I mean, my general background, in addition from being a professor of sports law, I run the sports department at my firm, Mord, Hock and Hammeroff in New York, specifically in Long Island. I worked back in the day for the Giants for 4 years, New York Giants in the public relations department. I've worked on the salary side of baseball arbitration. And then really, to make a long story short, I was pretty much a tried and true lawyer out of law school for maybe six years or so. And then, right around my 7th year, I got a job opportunity in a firm that handled sports and entertainment work. And then through that firm and handling work for entertainers, for athletes, I then kind of made the transition, essentially, close to full-time working in the kind of entertainment, celebrity, music space, and eventually to my own, to running a practice area myself at my current firm, Mord, Hock and Hammeroff. So kind of within that, I handle work in the professional sports landscape, the music space, the celebrity space. And then my passion, a lot of what I teach in class is very heavy on NIL, obviously given the brand new, fresh landscape that we've had and the changes in the law since 2019. I've been following it very closely from an academic perspective. And then I've had the great pleasure to teach it and bring students on like John, who have a real passion for helping athletes in that regard.
My background is definitely not as exciting as Dan's. I mean, he's been in it a lot longer than me, but so I'm from Staten Island. I go to New York Law School. I'm a 3L. So when I was, like Dan said, I was on in Dan's class, his sports law class. I think it was Dan's first offering of the class at New York Law School. And up until that point, there was really no opportunities through law school for me to get involved in sports, which is always, was always my number one passion. It's always what I wanted to do. So to see Dan's class in the course offerings was kind of a no-brainer. And I jumped in. And relatively early, I had approached Dan to start writing for his website, Conduct Detrimental. And he allowed me on, and I was there for a little while. And shortly after that, I became the news coordinator for that website. And then once NIL kind of started to explode, I had approached Dan because we have so many, clinics down at New York Law School where you get, your school credit for being in them. But we didn't have any, besides the Sports Law Society, we didn't have any projects or any clinics in relation to sports law, which I thought, was unfortunate because I knew there was a lot of interest. So that's when I approached Dan, and we kind of stood back and watched the trends of NIL kind of unfold. And then that's when we started to prepare for the project, which ended up taking, about a year or so to develop and then, finally release. But that's how it all started.
Got it. Now, what goes into forming a project like the New York Law School Pro Bono NIL project? I imagine there's a lot of hoops that you have to jump through, but what particularly did you guys face?
Well, let me. I guess I can take this first, John, and I'll give John his credit. John, to his point, he was the one that brought it up, right? So, New York NIL is relatively new, right? That's November of 2022, but obviously the NIL era started in July 1st of 2021, and we knew for about a year and a half up to that point that we were teaching the class. I think our students had a lot of knowledge about the particular area, yet. Maybe there were more athletes that needed help, new schools that needed help, agencies that needed help, prospective agents that needed help. So, Dave, to your question, like what goes into something like that, and John can speak to this a little bit. A lot of it's red tape, a lot of it's administrative tape. Are you allowed to start a club? Right. That's essentially what this is. It's only open to New York Law School students. What goes through with that? I imagine a lot of your audience, have gone through the process of either being a part of a club during law school or during college, and all the kind of bells and whistles that go with that. So originally, John and I had the idea to try to propose this as a clinic for real course credit in a class, essentially, that you could get real academic credit for being in this space. And to New York Law School's credit, they said, we're not really ready to make this a tried and true clinic, but if you want to make this a project and you want to advertise that you will work with athletes, as long as you have the right attorney guidance, be it in the state of New York, we'll talk about that in a minute. You're free to kind of recruit as you see fit, and just as the way that normal sports law goes, there's so much demand for people to be able to work in sports, and there on the other side is really not that many opportunities. So maybe this will make sense. Like there's always this requirement in order to work in big law, right? To work for a big firm, you need prior big law experience. The same is kind of true for sports law. People would like for you to have worked in sports in order for you to get a sports job. So the impetus behind creating this was really, let's create a way for New York Law School-based students to work in sports, to really go through that mechanism, to be experts in their particular field, to have the conversations with schools, with agents, with athletes where appropriate, local businesses, and then maybe that will help them at the next level get a head start in that particular sports law world. So that was really the impetus. That was, John can speak to the actual mechanism, what was submitted, but that was how we pitched it to New York Law School, that this could be a benefit to helping students on our end get jobs, but on the other end really help maybe businesses, athletes, agents, schools that just really don't know, what's being taught, changes in the legislation. So that's really how we got from point A to point B.
So yeah, just to add on that, I would say, like Dan said, there was a lot of red tape. There was a lot of communicating with school administrators. It was emails and phone calls and preparation. And I think, Dan, tell me if you agree. I think a real big part of, what we did in forming it and how much work it took was how are we going to form it to make sure that the students get, the best experience they could, while also giving athletes what they needed in that current NIL climate, which was changing daily. I mean, I'm sure you guys remember in the beginning, it was just so many things were changing. States were proposing new laws, which is another big thing that we did in the beginning is we had one of our members actually keep a database of every state law regarding NIL, whether it was proposed and separating those from the ones that have been enacted. And on top of that, also those laws, which included high school provisions. And because those things were changing so rapidly because everybody was trying to get involved, that's part of what took so much work in the beginning is to make sure that we had the right people who were keeping up with those things so that our information was always up to date and things of that nature. But we created it because there was a clear need for the students and there was a clear need for the athletes. David, I know I've watched a few of them, the red flags videos that you do on LinkedIn. Those are necessary. Those are important because it's very clear that in the beginning, athletes were having trouble finding their footing simply because people on the outside sometimes would try to take advantage. I think it was pretty clear. And that was one of the things that we kind of formulated into the project is that we were going to be more of an educational or resource center so that athletes would be able to navigate on their own, what looks off to them, what should they be looking out for in a deal that they need to make sure that they don't accept a deal that includes it. One of those things, I don't know if you touched on it, David, was athletes were being offered contracts where they would be locked in past their eligibility, which, we made a note of that. We said we need to make sure that athletes who are looking for, education know that they need to be on the lookout for something like that because an athlete might not realize that before they sign that deal. So just little things like that, really paying attention to what was going on, in the NIL climate at the time. That took up a lot of work along with the other red tape stuff that Dan talked about.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important to note that the NIL, allowing student athletes to monetize their NIL, was something that empowered them, and it was a restoration of rights that had been stripped away. But there was the challenge in making sure that empowerment really had teeth was making sure that student athletes were educated and knew the pitfalls, knew what things they should be watching out for when approached with NIL deals or arrangements, which leads me to the topic of the NCAA recently stating that they were going to prohibit universities providing pro bono services to their own student athletes, whether it be financial literacy or legal services or things of that nature. And I wanted to get your guys' thoughts on that. I mean, it seemed counterintuitive for the NCAA to say, okay, NIL is cool. However, we're not going to let universities educate athletes on NIL.
Go ahead, John.
So yeah, I think I guess I'm somewhere in the middle. Because, in my mind, just in our version of the project, the good thing about us is we're not tied to any specific program because we don't have any athletics.
Mm-hmm.
So I think maybe in the eyes of the NCAA, maybe having that education tied to the university, they didn't want some sort of conflict or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I don't see why the NCAA wouldn't want the athletes to be given every resource they can, especially financial literacy, which was something I was focusing on the other day. Which I don't know if you guys saw with the Covington twins having a deal with TurboTax. I thought that was really great. Right. But I think it's important, especially financial literacy. I think that's really important, and I don't see why the NCAA would kind of prohibit the institution themselves providing that, unless it was because they wanted the athlete to go out on their own and find that, so that there would be no interconnection between what's going on. But other than that, I mean, I don't see why they would have had a problem with it. Dan, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on it.
Why would they have had a problem with it? I think that's anyone's guess. The NCAA works in mysterious ways, we'll say, and sometimes they don't work at all. So I guess we can leave that there. But yeah, I think the schools, for whatever reason, wanted to, or I would say the NCAA wanted to get a level of control over we'll say the conduct that was occurring at some of these clinics that were around the country. So I think it's been well reported. A handful of these had popped up around the country, and it seems like a pretty good thing, right? That athletes were being given, for the first time in their life, right? 6-figure contracts, sometimes 7-figure contracts. And the fact that they might be able to have advice from a law firm for free, for pro bono advice, that doesn't sound like a bad thing. And then especially as you go down the line, right? A lot of these deals are not 6- and 7-figure deals. They are 4-figure deals and maybe 5-figure deals, and sometimes hundreds of dollars, right? Not that much money. And maybe an athlete is still scared to sign a $100 deal for fear of jeopardizing their eligibility. Now, I think if we're talking about like utilitarianism, certainly it makes a lot of sense to have athletes have access to, every school to have a version of a pro bono clinic. And to John's point, what the NCAA said is that, if a clinic exists at a particular institution, be it a Division I, Division II, Division III, and they're offering these services, there might be some retribution or some punishment for that particular institution. So, for example, right, if the University of Louisville Law School had a pro bono clinic, that they might punish the actual undergrad of Louisville, the basketball program, the football program. Now, is that fair? I wouldn't think so. The NCAA has kind of said, well, if you're providing those services, those legal services, you have to provide that to every student, not just student athletes. Is that fair? Sure. But that obviously resulted in a lot of these clinics, I don't want to say a lot, a handful of the clinics to be shut down because, the clinics existed to help athletes and maybe there just wasn't enough manpower to help any and all student athletes, right? Or any and all students. So do I think it's fair what the NCAA did? No. Can I understand their reasoning? It's kind of like the archaic version that, student athletes can't be treated differently from the rest of the student body. I can't really make sense of it. I just know that for our purposes at New York Law School, we don't have an undergrad. We don't, for better or for worse, we don't have a basketball team to root for or a soccer team to go to their games. So for the NCAA's purposes, the guidance didn't really affect what we were doing at New York Law School. But yeah, behind the motivation of why the NCAA did that, I can't really tell you.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because if the NCAA now is taking the approach that student athletes should be treated just like the rest of the students, so if they're getting services, the rest of the students should be getting services. It doesn't really line up with the NCAA's motivation for not allowing student athletes to be able to monetize their NIL for years when other students, even students who are on scholarship for like academia, for example, could. So it just seems like that is a hypocritical stance and just kind of not really in line with the NCAA's historical viewpoint on student athletes and in relation to their non-athlete counterparts. What do you think? So, of course, New York Law School doesn't have an academic program associated with the school. I've talked to some people, some lawyers who've floated the idea of creating pro bono projects, or just as their have their law firm provide pro bono services to athletes at particular institutions. Do you think that the NCAA would also have an issue with that kind of arrangement?
Well, I guess we could answer it this way, right? And Dave, I'll pose a question to you. We're 19 months into the NIL era. Has the NCAA done anything by way of violations or prohibitions?
Right.
Right. So
Not a thing.
it's a rhetorical question. They have yet to do so.
Yeah.
And they're certainly gearing up for a fight by hiring new enforcement officers and claiming on, and I'm sure we'll get into it. And I'm sure if you haven't spoke about it already, this kind of flipped presumption of guilty until proven innocence. The NCAA is sending a lot of messages that they are ready, willing, and able to hold these schools and violators accountable. They just have yet to do so. So, would someone be so inclined to start a collective and say, "I dare you, NCAA, come after me"? Collective, maybe, right? But with respect to a pro bono clinic or project, I'm not sure. I'm not sure, as they say, like the juice is worth the squeeze. You're providing free labor and free advice to athletes, and then you might get your school in trouble. That doesn't seem right. And then the collectives, which we haven't really spoke about here, but that's an assortment of donors or boosters or alumni pooling money to potentially give to a collective, right? A kind of a made up fictitious entity or a brand new entity in order to pay athletes and help kind of negotiate and collect NIL deals on behalf of athletes. Now, maybe would someone feel so inclined to create a collective, even though the NCAA might not be okay with it? Maybe, because that might directly impact the school's ability to land and recruit top talent. A pro bono clinic or project, I'm not sure that necessarily moves the needle. I think it's a nice service to offer, but I don't think a recruit is going to pick school A over school B solely because of a pro bono project or clinic. A collective potentially, if it can bring in enough funds. But yeah, I'm not sure the NCAA is going to punish any schools, but I don't think anyone's going to take that risk at that point, which unfortunately chills a lot of these great opportunities we've had for our law students. And it's kind of a shame that around the country, we're not going to see that, maybe ever, because of the guidance that the NCAA put out towards the end of 2022.
And if I could just add to that, I don't know, it seems as if, although in the beginning you could clearly see athletes were making some decisions based off NIL, a lot of the studies that I believe that at least that I've read have shown that the athletes aren't, choosing schools solely based off of NIL. Usually, I think there's 4 or 5 other factors that come before NIL when it comes to most athletes choosing a school. And, I think that's about where it should be. I don't necessarily think it should drive the athlete to go to a particular school, but I definitely think it should have some impact, and athletes should definitely be aware of it before they do choose what school we're going to go to. And that brings up another point, is that we'd like to get high schools involved as well. I think seniors especially need to be advised about what NIL even is, because if you talk to a lot of seniors in high school, they really don't know much about NIL. And they can be going anywhere in the country, and as we know, depending on the law, that could have a huge impact on your NIL landscape if you even have one. So that's, I think, another good point, that another good thing that I think is kind of undervalued in the current landscape is whether high school athletes know truly what they should be looking out for.
Yeah, that's one thing I was going to ask, because New York is a state where high school NIL is available. California is a state where high school NIL is available. So I'm counseling. I have parents reach out to me on behalf of their high school students, asking me questions about NIL, and I'm giving them some advice and some education based on that. Have you guys with the project? Have you to this date talked to any high school students as part of the project?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to a handful of high school students. I think I think we've done some, how do I phrase it? I think we've done probably more guidance for non-high school parents and athletes about high school NIL laws. Seems to be a little tricky, right? But we've spoke to schools, we've spoke to agents, um, we've spoke to agencies, and when I say agents, I mean like prospective young agents that might want to get into the space. They're just nervous about how particularly to do it.
Right.
Yeah, but New York was the second state in the country to allow for high school NIL, and it's still kind of an untapped area. I think people see this, at least at the high school level, that they're not really sure. It's just so taboo. Should we enter into this deal? Will it cost my child jeopardy? Their eligibility, would it put it in jeopardy? We haven't received those calls, but that's my understanding that a lot of parents are just kind of scared to do it, waiting for not wanting to do anything wrong to potentially do something that's akin to some level of inducement. And I will say, Dave, this is a very fresh area. This NIL landscape's only been around now for 19 months, legitimately.
Right.
So you can have a tried and true NIL deal for a high school athlete. That's not an issue, right? You can have any type of car dealership or shoes or anything like that. There's no problem. The issue when it comes to high school athletes, very different than for enrolled college students, is this level of improper inducement. So
Right.
if a particular booster for a particular school is giving an athlete a very large NIL deal, and they have yet to enroll at a collegiate institution, right, or a university, that's maybe by the NCAA going to be viewed as closer to being these inducements, whereas an athlete that's already at, let's say, we'll make up a school like a Villanova. I'm just picking a random state. A booster that's at Villanova and giving that Villanova student a deal, right, or a deal to not transfer to another school. Okay, right, they're already an athlete at that particular school. Now, it might be seen as a little bit different for a high school athlete who, as we've seen for decades, right? That famous scene where the athlete puts the hats on the table and they're
Sure.
considering which school they're going to go to, and they see their rivals.com percentage of going to X school or Y school. That's maybe, right? Maybe going to be viewed as being closer to an improper inducement by the NCAA. We still don't know it yet. And short of all of the states aligning their high school laws with their collegiate laws, it's just another kind of realm of regulations for attorneys, agents, athletes, parents to be concerned about. So we haven't gotten that many calls on it. And I just, maybe because there's less interest, less dollars at the high school level, not to say that we won't, and not to say that we're not open to helping in that regard. Just, I think parents weigh that risk reward calculus. And we haven't gotten that much outreach on that front.
If I could just add something to that as well. When it
Sure.
comes to high school too, I'm especially interested in high school when it comes to NIL, simply because it's not about contacting brands immediately and trying to throw deals in front of the 17, 18-year-old kid. You know what I mean? That's not what I would say when I talk about high school NIL. What I talk about would be content creation. Let's start
Yeah.
teaching about content creation.
Right.
Let's help these young athletes, right? Who, let's face it, at the end of the day, a very small percentage of athletes will play professional sports. But let's help these athletes go 2-for-1. I mean, they've made a name for themselves through their sport. If you can teach them content creation and the things that come with that, like building an honest, genuine brand of actually who you are, right? Things like that can go a long way when you finally do get to college and your name grows based on your sport. And if you go pro, that's fantastic. But if you don't, you have this content creation backup plan kind of. And by the time it comes to that point, you have already kind of built a very secure brand that has a clear message if you do it the right way. And that's what I would want to teach, high school kids when it comes to NIL, because every high school kid in this generation knows how to use their phone, knows how to post on TikTok, knows how to basically do all of that. It's just how to tighten it up a little bit to create a brand that could flourish after your playing days are over. And I think, that would really give a lot of high school kids a good opportunity if the interest was there, for sure.
That's a great point, John, and one that I think it goes back to how it was really there was an inequity when you had student athletes that weren't able to monetize their NIL. So social media content creation is something that's big these days. You have high school students that are doing it. Some of them that are pretty successful in building a strong social media presence. Some of them were able to monetize that social media presence. Actually, a lot of them act as influencers on TikTok. I know it's used a lot in the music production business, which Dan and I are a part of. And when you have an influencer that's able to earn money by monetizing their platform, and they're not able to just because they're a student athlete, that was an inequity. Now that inequity has been erased, and at least in now it's over half of the states in our country, high school students can monetize. High school student athletes can monetize their NIL through their social media presence. And so, John, I think that's a good point because if they're focusing on that, the content creation, building that brand, building that presence, it really has less to do with any kind of decision on what school they're going to go to. There isn't
Exactly.
really an issue of inducement or anything like that. It really is focused on the main thing of NIL, which, if we step back and remember, NIL is not it's not supposed to be a pay for play or have anything to do with where the person is playing their respective sport, but more to monetizing the name, image, and likeness. So I think that's a really good point when it comes to high school students, and it also is one that goes to when in high school a person can start thinking about NIL. It's not just their senior year, but earlier on in their high school career as they're building this content creation business and this social media presence.
Right.
Um, on the issue of inducement, I've been challenged with providing advice to high school students and their parents, families on making decisions about where they're going to commit, and just educating them on the role of NIL and how important it should be in their decision making process. And I always advise my clients that it's one of the factors, sure, but it shouldn't be the main factor. There's so many factors when it comes into play in terms of what school you're going to go to. I went through this process with my own son and his recruitment, and I've talked to many students and their families about their same decision. And I tend to be conservative on this approach when it comes to inducements, right? So I try, make sure that any discussions that are being held about NIL pre-enrollment are, something that's just really something that's kind of kind of esoteric conversations, just kind of speaking in generalities, because you don't want to trip that wire of being something that is an inducement. Even though, as Dan said, we're 19 months in, there's been absolutely no enforcement, nothing from the NCAA except so-called guidelines and refinements of those guidelines. So I want to end it with giving you guys an opportunity to talk about some specifics on how the project helps students and athletes and students, and how people can contact you guys to help or find out more.
So I'll just speak on that for a quick minute. And it all really depends on when the athlete reaches out to us, where are they, in their kind of NIL journey, right? Are they just beginning? Are they, are they kind of halfway through? Have they had deals before? Because we've had plenty of different situations when it comes to people who have reached out with interest. And I think for me, like, because we have so many people on staff, I would say we have I think it's about 12 people now. Some people focus on outreach. Some people focus on aggregating all the laws. For me, like I was speaking about before, I like to focus on teaching about content creation, and building a genuine following, rather than some athletes will think that just go out there and start following people and make sure they follow you back, and then unfollow the people that don't. But at the end of the day, if 2 or 3 years down the line, right, if you have 10,000 followers, but it's not really genuine followers, it's more of just, the people who you followed you back, and they don't really care about what you're putting out there, then when a brand partners with you, they're going to be able to tell that the things you're promoting are not going to be, there's not going to be as many sincere buys off of that Instagram page or whatever it is. But if you build 10,000 followers that truly appreciate maybe who you were as an athlete, or the values that you hold, that you've put out there on social media, things like that, that's when you'll start getting brands saying, okay, this person has a genuine following, a genuine base who really appreciates their values, and we line up with those values. So this would be a great partnership. So we do have people specializing in different things. In terms of contacting us, we have a email that we continuously check on it's nyls.nil@gmail.com. And if you also go to the New York Law School Sports Law Society webpage, there'll be a little intake form you could fill out, and then we will reach back out to you after you fill out the form. Dan, if you have anything else.
No, I think that's generally right. I mean, John kind of alluded to it early on. We, separate from the NIL Pro Bono project, we run, I'm the one of the founders of conductdetrimental.com. So we put out a lot of literature, and a lot of the kind of overlap of New York Law School students will publish on NIL articles on conductdetrimental.com. John runs our kind of news aggregation section. So when there are interesting and unique NIL deals, we try to cover it that way, or maybe with longer analysis through an article. So John has kind of laid out where to find us. You could just Google for those that just want to find it a little bit easier. You can just type into Google New York Law School NIL Pro Bono project, or you could just look up John or myself, and we'd be happy to point you in the right direction.
Excellent. I really appreciate you guys' time today, Dan, John. I really love what you guys are doing. Keep up the good work.
Absolutely. Really appreciate it having us on.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you for tuning in to episode 7 of NIL Active. See you next time.